Hi, welcome to Goodnight, Mr. Holmes, a podcast about the Granada Sherlock Holmes, which ran on ITV in the UK between 1984 and 1994, and ran on Masterpiece Mystery in the US around the same time. I'm Laura.
And I'm Rachel.
Today, we're looking at episode 5 in the series, which is called The Crooked Man.
Yeah, last week at the end of the episode, I called it A Crooked Man. That's because that's what BritBox calls it in their episode list.
Yes, I noticed the same thing. Yeah.
Exactly, The Crooked Man.
The Crooked Man. There can only
And we
be...
can talk at the end about who the Crooked Man is.
Right. So it opens with a maid bringing tea, and she knocks on the door and she's calling out, but the woman she's bringing tea to is in an argument with a man yelling, "I hate you, I hate you." And there are other servants, 2 other servants milling around as the maid frantically tries to open the door.
She's banging on it and making a lot of noise, which I feel isn't the usual decorum for a maid in a wealthy family, which makes me think that domestic violence is probably not unusual here. It's like she's trying to stop something.
Yes, I agree there completely. Yeah, because most servants are going to be discreet when their superiors are in an argument. They don't want any part of it. Mm-hmm. Back away. So the footman comes and tries the door, and that doesn't work. He can't open it. And then the woman inside, who we come to know as Mrs. Barclay, screams. And the maid screams back to open the door, which again is not your typical deferential behavior. Mm-hmm. And the footman runs around outside and comes into the room from the French window, where he sees Mrs. Barclay lying on a couch and the colonel, as we come to know him, Colonel Barclay, sprawled out on the floor by the fireplace. And the footman says the door's locked from the inside as well, and there's no key. So he's going to go for the police and a doctor.
And presumably a locksmith.
That comes in later.
Yeah, it does.
And then we go to Watson and Holmes walking, escorted by a soldier, through some kind of military arsenal's courtyard. And I just thought this was so hilarious. Watson's proclaiming, and we can't hear the beginning of what he's saying because soldiers are on horseback and they're drowning him out. But basically, he's talking about someone he traveled back from India with, telling Holmes he's a very good man and a good soldier.
Well, he's talking about the regiment.
Okay,
is the Royal Mallows, and for some reason, brain wanted to translate that into Royal Mallards. Quack, quack, quack. And I read in American editions of the story, the name of the regiment is given as Royal Munsters.
Yes.
Which is an actual regiment name. The Royal Mallows was invented, and they're wearing black and red uniforms with like interesting hats they
look like bellboy caps.
Yeah, exactly. I hope they don't wear those in combat. Apparently, Conan Doyle was horrified by British casualties in World War I and advocated for helmets and body armor.
I did not know that. Wow. Well, this is definitely not that.
Definitely. This is definitely pre-sane uniforms.
Yes. The most useless headgear you could possibly think of.
Yeah. So Watson, he's familiar with this fictional regiment. He's saying somewhere on the ship that he sailed back from Afghanistan on, and he doesn't really go into detail about why he therefore thinks that they're great and honorable. Like, I don't know, they were well behaved on the ship, I guess. Good record, he says, good record out in India, did wonders during the mutiny, and I have after that LOL.
Yes. Well, I looked into said mutiny. It was real.
Yeah. He's referring to the Indian Mutiny of 1857. For some reason this episode says 1858, but we'll get into more of it later.
Yeah. Yep. And what I noticed is that Watson seems kind of pompous here. because he's in his element.
Yeah, he seems very comfortable in a military setting, and
He
Holmes
loves it.
quietly marching by his side, looking sort of sour. I read a blog post saying that this particular story, and they were talking about Doyle's short story, was really interesting and touching because it starts, as you said, with Watson married at his home, wherever that is, and then Holmes comes in, and they sit around smoking a pipe, and Holmes tells him the basic trappings of this case that he's working on, and asks Watson if he wants to come along for the resolution. And it's really touching to see Holmes go out of his way to demonstrate that he wants Watson's company. Well, Watson's not married in this series, so
Right.
yeah.
And I also felt like Watson in these settings, he feels like he's got the edge over Holmes because he knows the rules.
Yes.
And how to behave. And as the son of country squires, even though Holmes behaves however the hell he wants, he's still got that he's got to be a British gentleman.
Yes.
So
yeah, and Watson says, "You won't regret taking the case," to Holmes, who looks like he's already regretting taking the case.
Bored and unhappy.
Exactly. I could be home shooting up walls, injecting pain. But no, I'm here. Oh, and someone, as they march off the camera, somebody is shouting, "Left, left, left, right, left," which sounds like he's shouting out dance steps because it's kind of hard to march that way.
Yeah. In Girl Scouts, actually, that we did that. Left, 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 right, left. And I mean, obviously, my troop was run by people who knew nothing. And then Watson comes into this guy's office first, and the guy's name is Major Murphy, and he's running things since the colonel died. And Holmes kind of trails in behind him.
Yeah, I got the impression from the way he and Watson greet each other that it was Murphy who reached out to Watson.
Yeah, I think.
Asking to convince Holmes to come.
And Watson says he understands that the regiment wants to avoid a scandal. And Murphy confirms this, but then Holmes says the scandal is going to be inevitable. And Murphy says that's impossible because he's kept the reporters as far away as he could. And Holmes says, exactly. That's what has made them suspicious. And so Murphy and Watson agree it would be wrong to draw attention to the situation, and that therefore that's the conundrum they're under. And Holmes is annoyed by all of this and just yells at Murphy to tell him the facts. And
Watson closes his eyes in embarrassment.
Yes, he's cringing. He's cringing because Holmes is acting like this is all beneath him. And Murphy says that Colonel Barclay was found at 10 p.m. dead in his morning room. So again, odd. He's dead at night in the morning room. What's he even doing in the morning room at nighttime?
Yeah, and that sounds really facetious, except the Victorians were strangely literal about their rooms, like the bedroom where you did your sleeping, period. There wasn't a desk there. No, it was a bedroom. So the morning room was for the morning.
And I think it probably had to do with heating.
Yeah.
And light. Like a morning room would get the morning light and be pleasant to sit in at that time. And, a drawing room was for later after the sun had gone down and you've got people over.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Holmes does point out later, why would Mrs. Barclay at night have gone into the morning room where a fire hadn't been lit?
Exactly. Yep. And it turns out this footman who found him was not a footman, but was Barclay's former Batman, which is kind of a valet for military officers, which we learned about in Downton Abbey.
Yeah, they don't have Batmobiles, sadly.
No, or even bats. And he now works as a servant in the Barclay home. And Barclay's head has apparently been coshed in by a singular hand-carved wooden club, and Mrs. Barclay was lying in a faint on a couch nearby. And then Holmes asks Murphy for more details and promptly begins acting like he's not listening. He's jumping up from his chair. He's stalking around the room like he's looking for something. Murphy describes the scene that we opened on, and Holmes gets right up into Murphy's face at this point, like really invading his space.
Yeah, he's like 6 inches from Murphy.
Yeah. And says, "So you suspect Mrs. Barclay?" And Murphy says, "Well, it looks that way, but he doesn't think she's capable of murder." He has said he's known her for years. He knows her very well.
And Holmes raises his eyebrows at
Yes.
that. Miles.
He doesn't believe anything about anybody ever.
But also, like, I took it as you've come to know her well.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God. Jeez. And then Holmes asks about the colonel, and Murphy says he was a good man despite his background. At which point, Watson makes a leap, and was the colonel ever disgraced? And Murphy says no, but he started out his career as a private in the regiment and rose through the ranks, which Watson points out is very rare. Because most of the officers are drawn from the aristocratic class.
Yeah, it was his gallantry during the mutiny that got him his commission. So
yeah. So at that point, he was no longer a non-com. He was a commissioned officer. And that's kind of a bit of a sore point with Murphy. He's jealous of the rapid.
Yeah. He points out that Barclay's rise was more rapid than mine, and the tone of his voice is that piece of shit.
Yeah. All the while saying that he's a good man. He's a good man. No one has formally arrested Mrs. Barclay, so she's in the hospital with a police escort, out cold. As women are portrayed to be throughout this whole series, they faint, they're down and out and completely unconscious for an unspecified length of time.
I mean, I fainted before.
You wake up.
Yeah, you wake up, like a second or two later, and you're like, oh, I'm on the floor.
Right.
Huh.
Yes, exactly. It's not like...
Yeah, you're not out for like days.
No, it's not a coma. Murphy says that 30 years ago in India, Mrs. Barclay was a beautiful woman, and she's still, considered beautiful, even though she's older. Her father was the sergeant major in charge of the regiment where both Barclay and Murphy were serving.
Yeah, and we see her, they do this, she's a pretty woman thing where like she's wearing white and just she's smiling and twirling and being a pretty young woman. It's for some reason in front of billowing white curtains. This
is the 80s.
Yeah.
This is what they did. This is 80s production values. If you think back to, God, I don't know, what's Dallas or Dynasty or any of those shows, similar type of like almost Vaseline on the lens kind of thing.
Yes, it's very much giving that vibe.
Yeah. And Murphy refers to her as the daughter of the regiment. So men were after her, but they were afraid of her father. And according to Murphy, she chose Barclay as her husband.
Meanwhile, we see 2 men with her, and then we see her kissing one man. And as Murphy is talking about Barclay, the camera pans over to somebody that we assume is Barclay watching them.
Right.
While Murphy is saying, well, she chose him, so anybody could pat her, but she chose Barclay. But we're seeing something else on the screen.
Yes. And after the marriage, Barclay got this huge promotion, and Murphy said there was social friction because Barclay had been a non-com and had risen up essentially by hard graft, like it as opposed to the aristocratic kind of tradition of being given something. But the couple made things work, and Holmes asked if it was a happy marriage. And Murphy says to all outward appearances, it would seem so, but he thinks otherwise. So we flash back to one night after having dinner with the Barclays. Murphy was halfway down the drive back home when he realized he'd left his cigar case. So he went back. The same maid, let him in, saying the couple had gone to bed. But at that moment, both Barclays appear in the upstairs hall with the colonel yelling at Nancy to confess. And he's going, "Who is it? Who is it?" And he's grappling with her. And she's like, "You're hurting me." And the colonel yells, "Tell me you love me and nobody else." And Nancy says, "Would I have married you if I didn't?" And the colonel says, "Sometimes I wonder." It's his own guilty conscience.
Yeah, well, we'll find out a little more about that.
Murphy says that Barclay was occasionally violent. He could be vindictive to those beneath him in the pecking order, but his rise had required a certain degree of ruthlessness.
And it's really hard to marry your way to the top.
Yeah. And he was also subject to, quote unquote, a peculiar form of depression.
So we got to Barclay in a flashback, toasting the Queen, who I guess is depressing.
Well,
I mean, she was.
But sometimes when reflecting back on old times with his pals, he would get gloomy. And Watson says long service in India can have that effect. And basically he's referring to PTSD.
Yeah. Which I don't have great sources on this, but I have read that Doyle worked with soldiers who had PTSD.
That would make so much sense. I mean, there were a lot of them at the time coming back from Afghanistan, from India, from, the empire.
Yeah.
South Africa. So Holmes goes back to the club. Where did it come from? And nobody knows, but the police are holding it. They think it's the murder weapon. And then Holmes asks if he can interview Mrs. Barclay, but she's still unconscious. And we flash to her bedside where she's muttering, "David, David." And
I rolled my eyes at that.
I did too.
We can get into that. Yeah.
She flutters open her eyes and says, "David, David," and then she goes back. And Watson and Holmes then take a carriage to the Barclays' house the next day. And Watson's theorizing that Mrs. Barclay was having an affair with Murphy. And the way he puts this is so, I need to capture this. "Mild adultery has always been common among officers and their wives serving in hot climates."
I want to know what he means by mild adultery. Like there was
he's talking about flirtations and
like there was an episode of the Forsyte Saga, the remake, like,
with Damian Lewis
20 years ago. Yeah, where two of the characters are discovered to be adulterous because the wife finds the husband and I think it was the governess standing together in a room. So is it that kind of mild adultery?
Yeah.
Or is it like they have orgies, but it's not flat out adultery because both parties are
right.
Like what is mild adultery?
I know. I mean, it's like you contrast that with, years later, the Happy Valley set in Kenya, where they were all sleeping with one another quite openly. But Holmes dismisses the possibility of an affair with Murphy because he says Murphy would never have told them about going back for the missing cigar case if that was, what was going on.
Yeah. He wouldn't have wanted to bring up that Barclay was accusing his wife of infidelity.
Exactly. So Watson and Holmes prowl around the house, followed by the servants, in particular, the maid.
the maid Jane, who's following them like she doesn't trust them not to steal anything that's not nailed down.
Exactly. And so Holmes asks her about the night the colonel died. And she says, and we kind of flash back to this as well, I was very impressed with her uniform, honestly. She had the little cap, but these long ribbons going down the back. Her apron was very fancy, so they're well-to-do.
Yes.
She had been serving them dinner, and Mrs. Barclay got up and left to do some charity work in town. And the colonel kind of takes a dim view of the charity work. And Mrs. Barkley, and this is kind of like emphasizing her virtue,
Yes.
reminds him that good fortune should be repaid. And she kisses him goodbye and she leaves.
Yeah, the charity work is at the mission hall, so we which implies that it's affiliated with the church. So
Right.
also keep in mind that she's kind of a churchy lady.
Well, I mean, if you're of that class, upper
Yeah,
military, you know,
yeah, but she talks in Bible.
she does. She absolutely does. So Mrs. Barkley comes back to the house about like an hour and a half later. And the maid says she was pacing in the morning room. She's very pale. She's upset. She rang for tea. The maid went off to fetch it. And at that point, the colonel calls out to the maid, "Did I hear Mrs. Barkley come in?" I mean, the dining room and the morning room are
right next to each other.
Yes, he would have seen her.
I know. And of course, my smart ass mouth would have been tempted to reply, "I don't know. Did you hear her come in?"
Yeah, but you wouldn't have been employed very long.
No, I would not.
And it's clear the colonel's been drinking. There's a decanter and a snifter of brandy in front of him, and he's smoking his cigar. And the maid said she was about to bring Mrs. Barkley tea, which the colonel finds very suspicious. So he gets up and goes into the morning room, and that's when the argument starts. And at this point, yes, Holmes asks, why was Mrs. Barkley in the morning room at night with the fire unlit? And Holmes asks if the couple often argued, and the maid says, "Not to my knowledge." And we know that's a bald-faced lie.
Yeah.
We've seen them arguing in the past.
Yes. He also asks, did she often make a point of purposely avoiding Colonel? And the maid doesn't say anything.
No. So we're getting like a frisson of abusive, coercive control.
Yeah, but also she's a servant, and you do not gossip about the people you work for, because you'll be fired and nobody will want to hire you again.
Gone without references.
Yeah.
So the maid says in the argument on the night of the murder, Mrs. Barkley called the colonel a coward and told him, "You've ruined my life all these years." And then she shouted the name David twice. And Watson is like, "Oh, well, the colonel's name is James and Murphy's name is Patrick." And the maid says there were no Davids in the Barclays' life that she knows of. And then Holmes asks about the club, the carved.
Oh, but and then Watson asks, "Did they have any visitors named David?" Like, and me listening, like, what did she just say? They don't know anyone named David.
The maid says she hasn't seen the carved club, and it's really clear she does not like being questioned. And Holmes asks if she found Major Murphy's cigar case that night when he
does it Columbo style as she's leaving.
Yeah.
Oh, one last.
Yeah. And she says yes, which is now how he knows that she's been lying about the arguments. And then they interview the Batman, whose name is Bates, like Downton Abbey. Same Batmen are always named Bates, apparently. Who says that in the colonel's face immediately after he struck his head on the fireplace fender and died, when the Batman turned him over, his face was all contorted in fear. And Watson says, as if he'd foreseen his own death. And the Batman says, yeah, it seemed likely.
What a useless question.
Right. Meanwhile, the other maid confirms that the door to the morning room was locked and from both sides, and the key was missing, and they had to fetch a locksmith to come and open it because they couldn't find the key. At which point, Holmes says there's got to be a third person involved, the one who left with the key. And that person either entered or left through the French windows. The same windows that the Batman had come in to check. And then Holmes does his ballet outside the window, trying not to spoil any evidence. And he says, these are Bates's footprints. Although how he could know, I don't know.
Maybe he has a habit. I mean, it's Holmes. He probably does have a habit of staring at people's shoes and categorizing them.
And also, how could he tell? Because it's a patio outside.
Yeah, thank you. And then just grass.
And then he goes, and these are the footprints of somewhere else. And he follows those footprints across the grass and up a hill.
I question whether he could have actually seen anything.
Oh, I mean, this is probably like a production issue. Like the location that they were able to film this at didn't have, so they had to act it out, even though circumstances were not conducive to it being real.
Yeah, even though you look at the ground and you're like, there's no way you can see footprints.
No, very well maintained lawn. Yeah, no. But he yells back at Watson that whoever it was entered and left through the French window. And then back inside the house, Holmes sees animal footprints on the floor and somehow figures out that this animal had run up one of the curtains. And he says it's not a dog, not a cat, or a monkey. And I'm like, where did that come from?
Was that I don't know, maybe was that a reference to the Poe story of
Did people come back from India with monkey pets?
Well, they come back with exotic pets. We will be talking about next week.
Yes. Yes. And he whips out a tape measure, calculates from the footprints the size of the animal that has a long back and short legs, and it's carnivorous. And Watson's like, how do you know that? And he yanks off the cover to a bird cage by the curtain. So the animal ran up the curtain to try and get to the bird in the cage. And now Watson and Holmes go to the mission where Mrs. Barclay had been working that night. She had been sorting and folding used clothes. And a Miss Morrison, who is Fiona Shaw,
I noticed,
as a young woman, and oh my God, she's as formidable in this role as in any other. She's protesting to them that she can't betray a friend. And Holmes tells her Mrs. Barclay was happy when she arrived, but she came back to the house changed, and she owes it to her friend to tell Holmes what happened.
And she's like, oh, well, okay then.
The guilt trip works. So Mrs. Morrison tells the men that all kinds of men come to the charity, but that night, an old man with a crooked back who is lame and in quote unquote Oriental garb came in. And Mrs. Morrison was really struck by his, patheticness. And she pointed
Called him an extraordinary creature.
Yes. And pointed him out to Nancy that this man was unusually deserving of help.
Nancy is Mrs. Barclay.
Yes. And at this point, I think we can default into calling her Nancy.
Yeah.
It was kind of a turnaround in the narrative. So Nancy goes up to the man, asks if he needs help, at which point, Mrs. Morrison says, her demeanor changed. She paled as if she had seen a ghost, and the man was likewise affected, and they went into a quiet corner and talked, and then the man shouted at her and stormed out. And Nancy tells Mrs. Morrison that it was an old acquaintance, fallen on hard times, and not to tell anybody. Hence the promise. And Holmes asks the name of the man, and Mrs. Morrison says she doesn't know, but he's an old soldier who makes a living entertaining troops at officers' clubs with conjuring tricks.
Yeah, and they're in the Aldershot, which is kind of a military hub in England.
Right. Yes, exactly. Lots of soldiers around, lots of officers' clubs. And Holmes asks if she told the police, and she said, of course not. A promise is a promise. And then we go to the officers' club where everyone's singing My Darling Clementine.
We see soldiers and
fancy women.
Yeah, the typical old-timey companions to soldiers, i.e.
Yes.
Prostitutes.
Right. And Holmes just looks delighted to be in this atmosphere. And then the unfortunate man comes staggering in, and he's doing rope tricks. And Holmes sneaks up just as the man produces a mouse, which he then puts into a box and magically turns into a mongoose. Long back, short legs.
Looks like a ferret.
Yep. And as the unfortunate man begins to leave, Holmes confronts him. And I was really impressed by this, actually, because he gets down at his level. He's like practically getting down on one knee because the guy's really hunched over.
Yeah.
And he calls him Mr. Henry Wood and says he wants to talk to him about the colonel's death. So the three of them leave the officers' club and go back to Mr. Wood's hovel. And meanwhile, he's slinging around this basket with the poor mongoose inside. Like, you know, he's got it thrown over his shoulder and he's like flailing with it sometimes. And I'm just like, that poor mongoose. And Wood says that Mrs. Barclay is innocent. And when Holmes says, well, then you're guilty, Wood denies it. He said it was the colonel's own guilty conscience that killed him and he deserved killing, but Wood never laid a hand on him. And then we go back in time again. So Wood is in the same regiment as Barclay, in the same company, and they were both in love with Nancy. So those were the two men when we flash back to Nancy as a young woman. And
it was Henry that we saw her kissing while Barclay was looking on enviously.
And he also stresses that he used to be good looking, and he starts sobbing. Nancy's father didn't approve of Wood and wanted her to marry Barclay because he was better educated and better behaved.
Wood also says he was kind of reckless.
Yes. But Wood said she would have married him anyway had it not been for the mutiny. So Holmes asks why she didn't marry the man that she loved. And this is where we get into the 1857 rebellion. So it was called the Sepoy Mutiny at the time. And it basically, Indian soldiers didn't like being colonized.
Yeah, that is basically what it comes down to. What set it off was the British started greasing the bullets so they could be loaded more easily, and they were using tallow and
Hindus can't. Cows.
Yeah, tallow is made from animal fat,
cow fat.
Yeah, and
cows are holy animals.
Exactly. So that started, but it was basically according to the BBC website, the British had restructured India along European lines, decimating Indian history.
Yes.
A governor general seized states claiming that the Hindu custom of accession was illegal. Many sepoy regiments were recruited from, the BBC says, the wrong areas and castes.
Oh, God.
Didn't want to serve outside their own region. Promotion was on time serving rather than ability. And British kept trying to convert the Indians to Christianity.
Absolutely none of this is a good idea.
Right.
But they just felt like through force of might, they were going to crush. Not surprised. I mean, they should not have been surprised at this. So this regiment, they were trapped in their garrison and they needed to communicate with another group of soldiers who were further up in the country and get help.
Yeah, General Neal.
And Wood volunteered for the mission, went to say goodbye to Nancy, and then Barclay went to see him off and gave him advice on the best route to take. And Wood set off according to Barclay's directions. And was pretty quickly attacked by mutineers, tied up, hung from a tree, and he realized that Barclay had betrayed him so that he could marry Nancy. Well,
this put 1,000 lives at risk.
Yes.
And that didn't seem to bother him at all.
In the least, yes.
He got promoted because of this.
Yes, exactly.
It's appalling.
It's the British. The mutineers tortured Wood over and over and over again, kept him captive for years. And he says the whole time his dream of revenge basically kept him from succumbing. And one day some Afghans came and murdered the mutineers. So like there's all kinds of stuff popping off. And left him for dead. But he never went back to his regiment because he was ashamed of his appearance and the sadness of his story.
Yeah, it happened that General Neal was on his way there anyway and rescued the garrison. I would just like to point out that General Neal did all of this by essentially torturing and killing anyone who wasn't white,
Yes,
regardless of whether they were civilian or military.
exactly. Yeah, no, it was a scorched earth kind of.
Yeah.
And typical.
Yes.
So Holmes asks why Wood showed up in Aldershot at the charity when he was embarrassed and ashamed. And Wood says, I just wanted to see the old country before I died. And he didn't know that the regiment he'd served with was stationed in Aldershot. He just needed an overcoat and some English clothes. And he said his need for revenge had subsided until he saw Nancy. And they had this emotional chat at the charity. And he told her everything. He told her that Barclay had betrayed him and was responsible for his current condition. And Nancy was very upset and she left the charity. He followed her home and witnessed the colonel arguing with Nancy while the maid is banging on the door about tea and everything. And Nancy's telling the colonel what she learned, and she's furious. And he grabs her, and she says,
she doesn't really go into detail. She mostly just says, David, David, because she just talks in Bible.
Right. You betrayed him, though, she did say.
She did say that.
And the colonel's yelling at her, you're lying, you're mad. And in comes Wood from the French window.
Yeah,
and
posing dramatically in the French window.
Yes. Yes. Oh, yeah. And the colonel looks terrified and collapsed and banged his head on the fireplace fender.
He looks like he almost might have foreseen his own death.
Yes. And Nancy screams and faints. Wood takes the key to the room out of her hand and he's intending to get help, but then he's like, oh no, I look like the guilty party here. And he grabs his mongoose who has gotten out and leaves. And Wood asks after Nancy, and Holmes says, she's in the hospital, but should make a complete recovery. Which, how does he know?
Well, she just fainted. She's malingering.
She's a woman. That's what they do. And Holmes and Watson leave. And then, of course, back at 221B, Watson asks the obvious question, who the hell is David? And Holmes says, David was used as a form of reproach. King David, from the Bible, sent Uriah the Hittite into battle so that King David could take Bathsheba, Uriah's woman. And that's exactly what happened here. Watson opens a Bible, immediately finds the passage.
Almost like it was bookmarked.
2 Samuel verses chapter 11 verses 14 through 17, and says, you appear to have looked it up yourself since we returned home. And Holmes says, how did you know? And Watson brandishes the bookmark that was in the Bible and says, you used the bill from our dinner at Waterloo as your bookmark. And Holmes says, excellent, Watson. At which point Watson says, elementary, my dear Holmes. And he goes upstairs to bed. And yeah, and that's the end of the episode.
Yeah, we end with Henry Wood sitting by a fire. But I mean, on the bright side, she's single now. She's wealthy. Just ask her out. You can bond again over how much Barclay sucked.
Oh my God. Yes. No, but poor Wood needs to take a shower before he does anything. Yeah, they made him look like he hadn't bathed in years.
Yes, they probably haven't. So yeah, when Barclay, going back to that argument, when Murphy went back for the cigar case, Barclay was saying, you know, do you love me? Are you seeing anyone? You know, and she says, would I have married you if I didn't love you? And he
Yeah,
says, I don't know. Well, I
exactly.
mean, he knows he was the runner-up, that the only reason she married him was because Wood was presumed dead.
Yep. Yep. So he got her with him under false pretenses
Yeah.
and has been lying all his life.
Yep.
Really, Conan Doyle makes these men out to be such complete and total manipulators. And I mean, this is one of many, 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 many in the Holmes canon.
Yes.
That, you know, they've done their woman wrong and is, you know, they're controlling. I mean, in The Dancing Men, for example, the the man that the woman was running away from, like he just wasn't going to listen to her saying no. So
Yeah.
it's really, you know, these men acting like they can do whatever they want with the women that they're marrying, and they're just not very nice.
Yeah, they don't really care what the woman wants.
No, or even that the woman wants anything.
Yeah.
You know, she's a thing.
Yep.
She, you know, how I mean, I've been watching a lot of Severance, and that's where like the oh gosh, the people who are quote unquote on the severed floor are looked at as not being human. And that's kind of how these men are treating these women.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, how dare they have a will of their own or
Yeah.
any kind of agency?
Yeah. There was some recent study showing that when we think of men, we, you know, see them as a whole person. When we think of women, we tend to see them as a collection of parts.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that I first ran into that idea in the early 2000s, and it made me think back to when I was a teenager, focused on very specific body parts that I felt like I needed to improve. You know, like,
Yeah.
and the boys in my school were really like blatant about it. Like, you know, you'd be perfect if only your butt wasn't so big. You know, or you'd be perfect if only your hair was, you know, like, or whatever. It was like, change this part around to please me.
You need to go back in time and set a few kids on fire.
Yeah, come with me. We'll have a blast. Yeah, no, this was very much the era of, you know,
Yeah.
late 70s, early 80s, where boys expressed their interest in you by abusing you.
Yeah. Boys will be boys.
Right. But I
We
mean,
have to teach girls to put up with domestic violence.
and this is rife throughout the Holmes stories. You know, these men are just like, oh, you're perfect. If only you would just like slice off this piece of your arm and fit into this pattern that I need you to be in.
Yeah. Yep.
And I just can't get over the maid's uniform. She's plush.
Yes.
It's
I noticed it was brown when she, like a light brown when she was
in the
Holmes and
daytime.
Watson. Yeah.
In the daytime, yeah, because maids had two sets of clothes back in the day. They had their daytime clothes that they put on in the morning, and then when the household kind of shifted into evening mode, they would go up and put on a darker dress and a different apron. So the morning clothes were light. Sometimes they were pink, sometimes they were like blue, and then the evening clothes were dark.
Mates had enough to do without.
I know. And they all had to be starched. I mean, imagine you're getting up at the crack of dawn, working until everyone goes to bed, and you have to, wash and starch your uniform on top of everything else.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work.
Let's see. I think I have just one other thing. At the end, towards the end of Wood's recounting of his tale, Holmes says, well, I'm sure the police will figure all of this out and Mrs. Barclay will be fine. But if they don't figure it out, would you be willing to talk to them? And what's
Yes.
So there was this thing going around the internet a while back, pointing out that if Indiana Jones had never gotten involved in Raiders of the Lost Ark, it still would have ended the same way. This is the Sherlock Holmes version of that.
Oh yeah, it still would have ended. Yeah, exactly.
They didn't really do anything. They showed up and talked to some people and said, huh, I guess that's what was going on, and went home.
Yeah, he was superfluous to requirements there.
Yeah. I never remember this story.
No.
It always comes as a shock to me. And after I had rewatched this, I'm like, oh, that's why I don't remember the story.
Yeah, because he really is kind of the icing on the cake as opposed to the cake itself.
Yeah.
Did we want to talk about Watson's marriages?
Oh, yes.
We were talking about that before we started recording. But yeah, the annotated Sherlock Holmes is, well, the story that as written, Watson has been married. And the annotated points out they're not sure whether it's his first or second marriage.
They're both named Mary. Apparently, Doyle's mother's name was Mary, which makes Watson's wives' names very interesting. I especially like the second one, Mary, with the name Mary. My name's Virginia. Mary.
If you're going to be married to me, you're going to have to be Mary.
I have all of these monogrammed towels, and I'm not.
I mean, again, treating women like things. But Watson really did adore his mother. Not Watson, Doyle. Doyle. Yeah, I really adored his mother. Tried to get her to come live with him, and she refused to do it. Wrote to her every day.
Huh.
Yeah, he was really, really attached to her. So yeah, I mean, definitely Freudian.
Am I wrong in thinking she was a single mother?
No, well, yes and no. Functionally, yes.
Functionally, yeah.
The father was in a mental institution.
That's right.
And she got involved, and nobody's saying this, but she got involved with a man of a different class and went to live on his estate.
Oh.
And in a cottage. It was separate.
Nice.
Yeah. And Doyle will go there frequently and again try to get her to move. And she's like, no, I'm really happy where I am. I'm not coming to live with you, son.
So he was concerned about appearances, about the way it looked?
I don't know. It's not clear. I think he just genuinely, he loved her. He wanted her to live with them. He wanted her company.
Mm-hmm.
And she's just like, no, I'm an independent woman. I'm going to be here. Anything else on this episode that we need to?
That's all I have.
Same here.
Okay. So that's all from us this week. If you've enjoyed the show and haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. If you want to support us, you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Tell your friends and join us next week when we'll be discussing The Speckled Band. I'm rubbing my hands in anticipation.
Yes. All right. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.